Bob Murphy Show, episode 189.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, where apparently it's all Texas energy all the time. We've got back-to-back episodes here. Previous episode was my interview with Rob Bradley, talking about the history of electricity regulation in the United States, and then we focused on the issue of Texas. And today I am talking with Josiah Neeley, who is the Texas Director and a Senior Fellow in Energy with the R Street Institute. And Josiah and I are also going to be really getting into the nitty-gritty number crunching regarding the February 2021 Texas freeze and then consequent blackouts. So there's actually not overlap, though, between the two, that the stuff I talked about with Rob is largely independent from the stuff I talk about with Josiah, even though there's a lot of compatibility there. But again, so it's not that I'm just talking about the same stuff with a different guest. We really get into much different issues than the things Rob and I talked about. Also, just a little bit of background, and I will link to this stuff in the show notes page. So this is, again, bobmurphyshow.com/189. Josiah was the person that I was behind the scenes when I was first learning about, hey, wait a minute, maybe natural gas was the MVP of electricity production in Texas during this recent freeze. And so why are people like Paul Krugman running around saying natural gas was the main culprit here, the villain of the story, and wind had nothing to do with it? So Josiah was my go-to person behind the scenes to try to understand, where these people are coming from, because he's a pretty fair guy, and so I like to bounce ideas off him just to see if I'm being misled by my own prejudices. So Josiah was coming from the perspective that, yeah, this really was an issue of natural gas did not meet expectations, and that's really the thing to blame if you're going to pick an energy source. But as you'll see in the discussion, it's nuanced, and I say this without joking that I think the stuff that I wrote and that Josiah wrote on this event would really give you a well-rounded view of both sides. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Josiah Neeley. Well, Josiah, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to Urban Cowboys.
Well, thank you. It's sort of like with Air Force One, that apparently any plane the president gets on turns into Air Force One. So wherever you are, you can just declare this is an episode of Urban Cowboys.
That's right. I do wonder sometimes, like, if the president, for whatever reason, were to take, like, you would just get on Southwest or whatever, would that, like, Southwest going to Miami, would that would be Air Force One then?
That's my understanding. I have not, read deeply on the subject, but that is my understanding that they automatically, wherever he gets on, it turns into Air Force One. So,
all right. There you go.
So we're talking about what? Texas?
Yeah. Texas. That's right. Yeah. Texas. We had a little incident last month. I was one of the lucky ones. My power never went out, but millions of people around the state.
Did your water go out though? Because weren't you like putting ice in your bathtub? I thought I saw.
Yes. Yeah. So
by the way, folks, I wasn't like in his house looking in his bathroom. It was he put it on Twitter. He's kind of a weird, oversharing, we might say.
Yeah. So I even though I did not lose power, we did end up losing water for a couple of days because I guess it was the pumping stations lost power. And so they couldn't maintain water pressure. And luckily, which is kind of rare in Texas, there was a bunch of snow outside on the ground. So my son and I just scooped that up and put it in a bathtub. We didn't drink it, but you could use it to run the toilets.
Are you familiar with the Frank Zappa song on that issue?
Is it yellow snow? Is
Right.
that what
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is?
You're supposed to be wary of it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Even the white snow, when it finally melted, there's a lot of dirt in even
Mhm.
white snow, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend eating that. But yeah, so
Can I before you jump into the wonky stuff? Can I just ask you? Did you guys have a sense? Like, did the forecasters say 2 days out, like, hey, everybody, this could be a really big thing, and make sure you stock up, and like, were you aware that this could be
uh,
serious?
so I we definitely so the information was out there. I didn't necessarily probably take it as seriously as I should, because whenever it gets cold, my mom always calls and tells me, "Oh, you need to drip your faucets and put these like little things on your outside, like it's a little styrofoam thing that you put on your pipes so that they
Oh,
don't."
right. Mhm.
Um, and so that happens couple times a year. I get a call from my mom about that, and so I just registered. It's like, oh yeah, it's probably going to be about that. And then it was probably not until pretty close to the event that I kind of tuned in that this was going to be something bad. But I'm sure if I had been like watching the weather forecast closer, there was a little bit more advanced warning. But I don't do that
Right.
normally.
And also, I'm
Yeah.
guessing no, like at best they would have said, go to the grocery store because you might be stuck at home. They wouldn't have said get ready that your power might be out for 2 or 3 days.
Right, right. And I am so I am generally a bit of a prepper. So we do keep uh, a supply of food and bottled water here that doesn't have to be, the food doesn't have to be refrigerated or whatever. A lot of peanut butter, canned goods, stuff like that. So uh, that was not an issue. I did have one friend who, like, I guess saw the, like, oh, there's a storm coming in 24 hours, and they went out and bought a generator. So they at least
Wow.
were a little bit on the ball. But as it turned out, in our case, since we didn't lose power,
Hmm.
it didn't matter that I was that I didn't foresee that, I guess. Um, but anyway, I know that we both of us have talked in like prior podcast episodes about the event and what are some of the causes and who's to blame and so on and so forth. And I thought it would just for some of your listeners to kind of like review what I think the big kind of story is. And that is, when you have like, so as your most of your listeners are probably aware, we don't store electricity. You can't, like, there's a couple ways you can store a little bit of it, but for the most part, when you're using electricity, it's being generated at the same time somewhere else, and they have to match. And it's not just, if there, it's not just that if there is not enough electric supply to meet the demand, that someone's, an individual person's light won't come on. It's not like if you go to the store and they're out of bread, like the entire system can go down if there is an imbalance between supply and demand, right? So because of that,
I don't mean to put you on this. Do you understand the physics of that? Because I mean, I know
yeah,
that's a fact, but I don't actually get what actually happens. Why does that crash the whole grid? If
sure, yeah. So it has to do with the way that the equipment is set up. So in the United States, all the transmission lines and plants or whatever, they're designed uh, uh, for a frequency of 60 hertz, and there's also like voltage they have to be in. It doesn't have to be 60 hertz. Apparently, in Japan, they do 50 hertz, right? Is the frequency, but that's just what the equipment is set for.
Mhm.
And when you have an imbalance of, like, let's say that there is 70 gigawatts of electric demand and there's only 68 of supply, right? That's going to cause the frequency to fall, right? And as the frequency falls, the equipment will either get overloaded and damaged, or a lot of it they have safety features that like take it off. And this is why you may remember back in 2003 there was a big blackout in the northeast of the United States, like
Mhm.
through New York. that ended up happening because there was a sensor that was down that wasn't reading that there was an imbalance. And so a tree branch fell on like a power line that caused an imbalance, and just like you had a cascade of more and more stuff shutting off to protect itself from being like overheated and fried. And so that's kind of, this is kind of like the nightmare that you, as an electric system, you're trying to avoid, is that like, it would be as if a store runs out of bread, all of a sudden everywhere in, half the country, all the bread just disappears, right? And you can't get it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's obviously, there's a lot of focus that goes into avoiding that situation. And because of that, your electric systems tend to be optimized around when you expect the peak electric demand to be, right? Because that's the variable, different times a day and times a year, people want to use different amounts of electricity. And since you can't store it, you have to have it ready to go at all times. In Texas, that's the summer. And so our system is geared around the summer. In the winter, we're usually pretty fine. We usually are okay. And ERCOT, which is the grid operator, they do these seasonal forecasts. And if you look at the seasonal forecast that they did for winter 2021, they said they expected that they were going to have about 40% excess electric capacity, right? So they predicted we'll have about 57 gigawatts of electric demand. We'll have 83 gigawatts of electric supply capacity that we can call on if we need to. That's a huge margin. Most systems plan for something in the range of 10 to 20%, right? So 40%, there should not be a problem. And I would mention that like of that 83 gigawatts that they're counting on, only about 1 gigawatt of that is wind, right? So they were not counting on a lot of wind there, right? So
just to paraphrase or whatever to make sure, so that again, the big picture is when you're running these things, you got to say the system has to be able to normal customer usage. If it happens to be really high, we want the capacity to be able to produce that much on the spot to satisfy them. And then, of course, in practice, we think we won't need that much, but let's plan and make sure if they do demand. And then, especially in the winter time when, it could happen to be that people want to use a bunch on a day that's not very windy. So we can't assume that wind's going to have a big role to play. And so they're just building in and saying non-wind and non-solar, the so-called thermal plants, we think they can do this much.
Yeah, that's correct. And, they do know, particularly as you get closer, like 24 hours ahead, you tend to get better at estimating how much wind there's going to be. Mm-hmm. But they want, they have a high standard for what they can count on. And so they basically assume we're just not going to count on there being a lot of wind.
I don't mean to quit. The only reason I'm saying that is because actually, I know you saw my article. Off the top of my head, I think like the previous year, I just went literally 12 months earlier. I think wind was like 40% or something of the power there. Yeah. So it's not that wind never works. They're just saying we can't assume because we could just get unlucky and maybe people want to use a bunch of power on a day that there doesn't happen to be much wind, and therefore.
That's correct. Yeah. So there is a lot of wind capacity in the Texas system, and if you get a good day where there's a lot of wind and the conditions are right, a large proportion of the electricity can be coming from wind, but because they're trying to think about what's the worst case scenario most, and then the numbers that I gave you were not the worst case scenario. That was just like their base scenario, I guess. Mm-hmm. But even so, they just as a general. As a general purpose, they view the wind as like if it's there, that's good. It's an extra, but if it's not there, we still think we have this really big market. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is we had this really bad winter storm. It was probably the coldest temperatures, I think, since like the 1890s or something. And it was all across the state. There was a lot of ice. So that did, which is not typical for Texas, right?
Right.
Minnesota or whatever, maybe. But so that did two things. One is the electricity demand went up, right? Because a lot of people were trying to heat their homes. They're using other things. So we ended up having an all-time winter peak for electric use, and we almost certainly would have had an all-year peak, all-time peak for electric use if there had been enough supply to meet it, right? So when they were looking, they're like, okay, yeah, our all-time is like 74, 75, and they were looking like we're going to go to 79. So that's part of it. That I think if that had been the only issue, I think that could have been managed. Would have been inconvenient for some people, but there are ways that you can deal with that. The bigger part of the problem is because of weather and related issues, you had a lot of power supply that just failed, right? Plants were not able to operate, or were not able to get the fuel that they needed to be able to operate. And I think they're at the lowest point, something like 48% of the total capacity was offline, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a huge amount. It's like half your generation system is gone. And so I so that's the basics. And so when I look at that, what I see is, for one thing, like these you had supply plant failures pretty much across every generation type. So there was a lot of wind that was out. There's a lot of gas that was out, but there was also coal out. Even a nuclear unit had to go offline because of like a sensor froze, and so they had to shut it down.
Yeah, I was going to ask that one. My understanding is the plant actually was fine, but because the sensor froze, a safety thing, they just shut it down, and so yeah.
Right. Yeah. They have to do that. Sometimes if they can't tell, that something could go wrong, particularly with a nuclear plant. They're very particular about that. So you did have, you had all failures of all types of plants, and there's nothing inherent, I would say, in any of the sorts of energy that made them fail, because you have like wind turbines that operate fine in Minnesota. You have natural gas plants that operate fine in North Dakota when it's a lot colder. It's just that things were cold for Texas. And in the same way that when the storm hit, there was ice on the road here, and that ice, there's ice and snow on the road, and that didn't get cleaned up for like 4 or 5 days, right? Basically we had to wait until it melted. A lot of the roads were impassable. And, when I lived up north, you would have, there were snow plows that would come out. Right. People put like ice, salt and other things on the road to break up the ice. Because that doesn't happen here that often, we're just not used to that. We're not ready for it. Mm-hmm. I think that's the same thing that happened with regard to our electricity system.
Can I tell a real quick thing on that? Yeah. I'm originally from upstate New York, and they're used to it, and we're right by the lake and get dumped on, and so we're used to that. But when I moved to Nashville, where it does snow but not that much, one year we got crushed, and in my neighborhood, like the little cul-de-sac, they actually ended up sending like a regular backhoe that just came to shovel. You know what I mean? Like it was like, as an economist talking about capital heterogeneity, like that was kind of a neat little thing that so just to show, it's not just there's a capital K. Yeah.
Yeah, my wife is from Minnesota, so she has a lot of comments about our Texan capacity when it comes to clearing up ice off the streets or whatever. But anyway, so I just say all that because from my perspective, when I look at the amount of the whole, which is really you went from like thinking you had 40% more than you needed to having 40% less than you needed. It's huge hole, and then. It doesn't there are some. I think there are some perhaps some specific issues related to natural gas supply that we could talk about. But for the most part, it's not something that I would view as inherent in any fuel type, right? So I think a lot of the discussion around the event has been about like different fuel types trying to blame each other, and uh, the gas people say it was the wind, and the wind people say it was the gas, and everybody. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think there are other issues that were involved, but the big issue is just that the Texas system was not set up and prepared for this sort of cold, and it's kind of like a Nassim Taleb thing, right? Mm-hmm. Where if you look at the forecast, they basically just said however it was coldest the last time, 10 years ago, that's what we're going to plan for as our worst case scenario, and it was a lot worse than that. Right?
Okay, so I think let me just amplify some of the points you made. That you're right. Yeah. The way because Governor Abbott and the Wall Street Journal and stuff come out swinging, saying this is basically AOC's fault with her Green New Deal that from the future retroactively screwed us. And then, of course, the people on the left, Paul Krugman and whatnot, like, oh, you idiots, you bunch of liars. No, it was the natural gas problem. Right. And so, and by the way, I would have been happy. Like I actually, people were asking me originally when this thing first broke, Bob, what do you think? You've worked in energy. And I just said, I really don't know enough about the specifics of the Texas grid. I shouldn't. But then it wasn't until I read some articles on it and I saw like, the stats that you're with how natural gas, like the week before the storm to the week, like natural gas shot way up in terms of its absolute output, let alone percentage of the total and thing. So that's why I thought, okay, I should weigh in on this, because I think the public, sort of had this idea that, oh yeah, it was just chugging along, the storm hits, and then all the different power sources got knocked way down from the day before the storm. And that's what the problem was when, as you're pointing out, no, the issue was they would have had literally the all-time record demand in Texas, even including summers, had they had the capacity to satisfy it. Did I catch you?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, okay. They think that they would have had like an all-time high demand. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I waited, just to say, well, no, there's a sense in which natural gas really was like the MVP, but it's sort of like if Michael Jordan has an off game, you can say we lost because Jordan had an off game, even though, well, technically though, he still was the MVP. It's just he didn't do as good as we were hoping, that kind of thing. And if the coach designs the strategy, get the ball to Michael, and then it doesn't work, you could say we were planning on him scoring 40 and he only scored 28, and so that's why we lost. Even though there's a sense in which, well, gee, if Pippen had been better, maybe we would have won. And then you're saying too, like with pointing fingers about, well, look at all these frozen wind turbines and that. It's not that wind per se doesn't work in the cold. And some of my Canadian colleagues up at Fraser were, warning me that if you're trying to, extrapolate from this to Canada, you gotta be careful because our wind turbines don't freeze up the way the ones in Texas did. And so
yeah. So in my understanding from talking to like wind people in particular, but I think this is true for other things too, is that, there's two weatherizing packages that you can have for your wind turbine, like summer package and a winter package. And if you have to like choose one, kind of like the things that you do to protect your turbines against cold weather make it not work as well in the heat and vice versa. Right. I think that's kind of true.
Okay.
And maybe other like natural gas or other things too. So that's part of, well, why didn't they just winterize? There's actually some trade-offs there. It's not just costly, but you can lose, your plants become less efficient and less able to produce if you're optimized for one temperature range and you find yourself in another one.
Okay. So I didn't realize that. Yeah, I was going to ask you if you know about the cost, because I've seen some people kind of say, look, this was it's not impossible. It did happen, but this was a very rare event, and maybe it would not have made sense for them to spend a bunch of money being ready for this. Maybe, clearly, if they had known this was coming, they would have done something differently.
Right.
Because there were huge costs, however you want to measure them, from what ended up happening. And so surely it would have been cheaper to prepare a little bit more, but not knowing ahead of time this was going to happen, maybe they'd say, yep, this was, in retrospect, we should have spent more on the front end, but it was a rational decision a year ago when we decided not to, quote, winterize, because it really was unlikely with the information we had to think it was going to be this cold.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure, the information is still coming out. Undoubtedly different plants chose to winterize to different levels. And so it's quite possible because, as you say, there were still a lot of, if half the capacity is out because of the cold, you still have the other half that's operating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there, as you noted in your article, there was a lot of natural gas that was still there. Probably some of those plants that were still there maybe were winterized to a higher standard, and that benefited them. It's hard to say because there apparently were issues of plants that said, well, look, we're operating fine, but we just can't get any gas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the wellheads had frozen. I think I was looking at something just before we talked on the EIA that natural gas production was down by 45% during that week because of either frozen wellheads or pipelines that freeze or other things. So you could have a lot of issues, but I'm sure that there are some people that did do that winterizing and they ended up coming out of it a lot better because of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Even there, do you know again? It's I'm an economist. I draw lines on a chalkboard. Do you, you obviously you'd like to build a bunch of batteries to charge up the batteries, when the wind's blowing. So we know that's cost prohibitive. But with the natural gas stuff, if part of it was the wellheads were frozen, and would it have made sense to store actual natural gas on site from some of these plants, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it. Certainly. I'm not an economist, but just looking at how high natural gas prices went, if you had known, if the time traveler had gone back 2 months and said,
right,
hey, this is what prices are going to be, I'm sure the stockpiles would have, they would have stored a lot more gas.
By the way, just to be clear, I was mocking myself saying I'm talking about energy economics, but I don't know enough about the actual mechanics of how a natural gas fired plant works to know.
Well, yeah, and I'm a lawyer, by training. So any subject I will talk as if
Maybe for the next episode we should bring somebody on who knows this stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe we could find somebody. So yeah, I mean, this is one thing is even though it's a month out, there obviously were a variety of sources of the failure. There were some things where it was sensors that didn't work or turbines that froze. There's some places where they say, hey, we don't know we couldn't get gas. We wouldn't have been able to operate. You have there's more technical reasons too. We don't yet have a breakdown of how much of it was due to any one cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
And very oftentimes when you have a system that's put under stress, you don't quite know where your weak points are, and then a bunch of stuff just kind of pops at once. So I think that's kind of what happened.
It probably was systemic racism.
Well, that hasn't been looked into, but I'm sure someone will look into that.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps Professor Kendi can look into that.
So now this actually is a good transition, perhaps into we were talking about if they'd known how high the prices were and whatever. So do you want to talk now about one of the scandals was the wholesale price? What was it, $9,000?
Yeah. So there was one other.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Other thing that I want to talk about, and that is it clearly, the problems was clearly really not. I would say, particularly the wind, because of the forecast and what was expected. But there is a more sophisticated argument about the effect of wind on the electricity system, which, as you know, wind power receives the production tax credit, a federal subsidy. It's about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And so there's some people that argue that, okay, because of that it means that you're going to have more wind on the system, and you're going to drive out other thermal plants, right? Because they're not going to be able to compete. They're not going to be able to earn enough money on price, or new generators are going to invest in wind as opposed to invest in natural gas or whatever. And so because of that, you're going to have less reserves that you can call on in an event, right?
And that's actually that was the argument I was making.
Yes, right.
So
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm one of the more sophisticated ones. Let me just if I plug in a number. Oh shoot, where is it? It's so what I did just to give is saying I looked at what EIA said was the maximum theoretical installed capacity as of summer 2020 for natural gas and for wind, and then I multiplied that by 24 because that was an hourly thing to say, okay, if these things ran at a day at their theoretical maximum capacity, how many kilowatt hour or megawatt hours, whatever, could they generate? And then I looked at, in fact, on February 15th, 2021, the first day of the blackouts, how much did those sources in fact deliver? Right. And so natural gas was like 46% and wind was only about 10%.
Yeah.
And so
from an economic perspective, it gets a little tricky because, wind is, so all different energy sources have what's called a capacity factor, which is if you build a megawatt of this energy source, how much can you reasonably expect to get out of it over the course of a year, say, right? Right. So if you're a nuclear plant, you're going to be above 90% because they basically always run unless there's some emergency. If you're a natural gas, it's probably going to be a little bit lower, but you're still talking about you're going to be able to get 70% out of it. And for wind, their capacity factor is probably closer to 30%, 30%, depending on conditions, right? So that's not a secret. So if a generator is trying to decide what do I want to build? Do I want to build a megawatt of natural gas, or do I want to build a megawatt of wind? I mean, do I want to build natural gas? Do I want to build wind? They're not gonna be like, well, should I build a megawatt of one or megawatt of the other? Because if someone comes in and says, hey, we ran the numbers and it's 30% cheaper to build a megawatt of wind than it is to build a megawatt of natural gas, so we should build a wind. Like, they're going to kick them out of the office because they're like, you can't get as much out of a megawatt, right? So it would be like, should we build a megawatt of natural gas or 2 megawatts of wind, or 2.5 or whatever? So that I do think that is important. That if you're trying to think of what would the system look like absent these subsidies, right? There clearly would be less wind on the system. There would be more of something else, but it wouldn't be a 1-to-1 probably, because you build out a great, if you're a generator, you get paid based off what you generate, right? So if you have a source that's only going to be generating, a third of the time, like Chick-fil-A, say, right? When they're trying to do their calculations of would it make sense to put a store here? They obviously are not open on Sunday. And so they have to figure out, are we going to be able to make enough money from 6 days a week, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, their chicken is so tasty that, probably can. But yeah, so I think that in this case, because the hole was so big, and to the extent that you have natural gas supply issues, I don't think that simply having some more natural gas plants instead of some wind turbines would have really affected the situation that much. So I definitely am not a fan of the production tax credit. I've written against it. Our mutual friend Rob Bradley likes to send me some of the old things that I've written about the, negative about the wind subsidies, right? Which I'm still against. But in this case, it just doesn't compute that it really has much to do with the event.
Okay, let me just distill that down to make sure because we were bringing up a lot of stuff rapid fire. So somebody like Abbott goes on Fox or wherever he was and say, oh, this is the fault of wind. Look at the news showing these frozen turbines and the helicopters trying to de-ice them. Clearly, it's a stupid Green New Deal. And then somebody like you comes along, or Ron Bailey at Reason.com saying, well, no, ERCOT's own planning memos show they weren't counting on wind to be a big deal. And then I come along and say, okay, that is true. But if you look at the actual, on that day in question, natural gas supplied 46% of its theoretical capacity, wind only at 10. And so to the extent that the expansion of wind, which was partly driven by federal subsidies, displaced how much natural gas capacity there otherwise would have been in a different universe when you didn't have the federal production tax credit. Then even though natural gas only had 46%, delivering of its potential capacity, 46% is bigger than 10%. And so therefore, and then now you're saying, okay, but had there not been, when wind expanded partly because of subsidies and displaced, other city, whether coal or natural gas, it wouldn't have been megawatt for megawatt. That installing new capacity for wind, yes, means there's less natural gas than there otherwise would have been, but it would not have been a one-to-one thing because everybody knows you can't just trust wind being on most of the time. And so therefore, your point is just the numbers, when you adjust for that, it's not like everything would have been fine had it not been for the production tax credit. There still would have been a huge hole had nothing else changed except for some more natural gas capacity and less wind capacity.
That's right. Yeah. And to the extent the issue was like fuel supply, like having more plants, wouldn't necessarily have done much at all. Right. And I don't know about that, but so the way I see it is like, there's a lot of other problems in the system. Those seem like the things you should address. Definitely, I'm against the production tax credit for all sorts of other reasons, but I don't think it played a big role in this event. Yeah.
Okay. So now is it okay to go to the pricing thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So to motivate, so I saw a thing I don't know that Krugman wrote it up for like his column, but I saw on Twitter he did a tweet. What's it called? Storm? Did you call him? And he was saying like, hey, Texas was supposed to be the land of free market energy. And in fact, I distinctly remember that there were, big boosters of this who said, oh, we're allowing for more flexible contracts that have, that don't strictly regulate the price, even at the retail level. And the theory was by giving more freedom to the independent power producers and allowing for flexible, real-time market pricing, if there ever were, a shortage or extra scarcity, let's say, the price would shoot way up, which wouldn't be allowed in other states perhaps, but Texas, the land of, laissez-faire, rah-rah. And then knowing that incentive was built in there, that would mean the producers would be rational. They would look ahead and say, oh, let's be ready for a bad storm or something, because then the price is going to go through the roof and we're going to make boatloads of money. So of course we're going to spend money winterizing on the front end because we're going to be able to sell it for $9,000. What is it? Is that megawatt hour? Is that what that price is for?
Yeah, $9,000 a megawatt hour. Yeah.
And so of course we'll go ahead and make sure our natural gas lines are protected from the cold, because otherwise we'd miss out on all this big money. We're not in those socialistic states with price controls. Here we are in the land of laissez-faire capitalism. And then Krugman, of course, says, well, look how that theory worked out, morons. So now discuss.
Right. Yeah. So it is true. Well, the first thing I would say is you kind of have to distinguish between wholesale and retail electric prices, right? And let's leave the retail to the side for now. For the wholesale, that's right. The way we try to ensure adequate supply is there's no price controls other than this $9,000 an hour megawatt cap. And so basically, when there is scarcity, the price goes up, and you have a lot of plants that are designed, they're so-called peaker plants. They only operate when the price goes up because they're expensive to operate, and they're not very efficient. They're basically just like a series of jet engines that you can run. That overall, I would say, has worked pretty well. If you do not use that system, then you have to think of like, okay, well, what other system are you going to use instead to try and ensure resource adequacy? And those other systems, they're pretty costly, but the most important thing is those other systems are all built around the same types of forecasts that ERCOT was using and said we had 40% reserves, right? Mm-hmm. So whatever your other system is going to be, you're not going to say, well, we need 40% reserves, and so you would, if we had a different system, we didn't have like scarcity pricing, we would have ended up in the same place, I'm almost certain. And in fact, the surrounding, our neighboring markets that are vertically integrated, SPP and MISO, they also had some rolling blackouts. I don't see that as a big issue. I think that here's a good illustration of that. Is the closest thing that we have to what Krugman is talking about is we have there's about a dozen power plants that the state pays to be ready in case of what they call a black start event, right? So if you had a situation like in 2003 in the Northeast where there was this, the entire system went down,
mm-hmm.
you need to be able to start it back up. And so we have some plants that say it's like, okay, you not only can you count on us, you can really count on us because we've got fuel on site, we've got everything set. We could start up and run power just by ourselves if necessary, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't need the grid, and we could feed power back into the grid to get everything else started, right? So of those, so we have 13 of them, and 6 of those 13 were out because of the weather, right? They had weather-related outages. So what that tells me is, as long as you're it doesn't really matter what your system is if you're using the same forecasts, right? If your forecasts are we need to protect to 3 feet of flood tide because that's the 100-year level or whatever, and then you get 5 feet of flood, you're going to have a problem regardless of whether your dams were built by the free market or by the state or whoever, however you make the system. So that's
any dam the state builds, it first took from the private sector, just to be clear.
Well, yeah, okay, fair enough. But despite taking it from the private sector, it's still the worst job.
Overseeing it, yeah. So let me. I get what you. Let me just push back again, and it's possible you did answer this and I missed it.
Yeah.
So I think what Krugman is saying. So it sounds like what you're saying is, look, the market's not infallible, and the intellectual error here was the proper, what they thought of as a pretty much worst case scenario in terms of the cold and the electric demand, they were just off. And then, so that kind of drove everything, and it, quote, deregulated or less regulated power producers, even licking their chops knowing, hey, in case this is wrong, there's going to be huge price spikes. And so don't you want to be ready to seize all these, huge profit opportunities? If they think that's not going to happen, they're not going to go ahead and prepare for that. And so, so that this isn't like a failure of capital. But I think what Krugman might say is, sure, okay, but our point though was that's why we should go ahead and have a normal jurisdiction where you have pretty close regulation of the producers and the prices are capped. And so if the authorities screw up and they totally missed the boat on the forecast, fine, you have blackouts somewhere, but at least consumers aren't getting hit with huge bills. And in fact, you can be more paternalistic and regulate them. Whereas in Texas, the reason they weren't winterized was because the state didn't have the authority to order it. They just trusted them. Hey, let the magic of the market work. And so now you had the worst of both worlds, where you had outages and people are getting hit with $17,000 monthly electric bills. Yeah.
So let me answer that in 2 parts.
Okay.
So on the regulation part, it is so. We mentioned earlier that we had a nuclear unit that went down, right? Mm-hmm. And nuclear units are federally regulated. I don't think anyone, even Paul Krugman, would say that they are lightly regulated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear power plants are very heavily regulated. That obviously, it didn't matter in this case, right? Similarly, to the extent that it looks like a big part of the problem had to do with natural gas supply, and the natural gas system, Texas did not deregulate that. George Bush, that's a whole separate deal, right? Mm-hmm. And we have a unified throughout the United States, pipelines go all over the place and so on and so forth. So so on the regulation side, I don't really see much of a case that if only, someone wise like Paul Krugman had been in charge and we had said, okay, you can do whatever regulations you want, don't worry about that.
Well, can I? What their specific allegation is they'll say there was it 2003? The last time there was a bad cold.
2011. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Maybe.
Yeah.
And
right.
then they're saying at the time some post game show auditors went around and said, "Wow, you guys should really winterize." And then the claim is they just ignored that because that costs money, and we all know businesses don't like to spend money.
So they definitely did not require. The state did not mandate any degree of winterization. Neither did the federal government. They do like advisory or voluntary or compliance type things. I would say that the forecasts that everybody was operating on, they used the 2011 event as their worst case scenario, right? So it was not, and winterization or weatherization, it's not an all or nothing thing, right? So you can winterize what you think is to a certain standard, and then it gets even colder, or there's more ice or something, and you find out that we're not ready for that, right?
Okay. Just to be, what you would say on that narrow point to somebody like Krugman is it wasn't merely that crazy Texans with their Wild West mentality didn't impose it. The federal regulators also did not require. Correct. And in any event, the producers could have said, okay, we've, in light of the 2011 debacle, we've retooled our capacity, blah, blah, blah. And we could totally withstand another 2011, which was the worst to that point. So we should be good now.
Right. Yeah.
And they just happened to be wrong. That's something even worse.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's happening. Then on the retail point, because there have been some stories of people who have a $17,000 electric bill for a month or whatever. And I think it's important to note that almost everybody in Texas is on some sort of fixed rate electric plan, right? So when you move into a house or apartment, you sign up for electric service. You, depending on where you are, you get to choose who you want your provider are, and they all have plans, like the old phone plans or whatever, right? Where it's we'll charge you 8 cents a kilowatt hour, or sometimes they'll have tiered rates, so if you use more than 1,000 kilowatt hours in a month, then it goes up to a higher rate or whatever. But you're not paying wholesale market prices, right? You're not paying, if the wholesale market price goes up to $9,000, your rate doesn't change, right?
You're saying for the vast majority of Texas consumers.
Right. So there's about 7 million electric customers in Texas, and all but about 42,000 are on some sort of fixed rate plan, right?
Okay.
There were a couple companies, the primary one being Gritty, that their deal was,
which sounds like greedy.
Yeah, it does, yeah. And Grid, yeah. So their deal was, they said, look, we're just going to charge you whatever the wholesale market rate is in real time, plus a $10 a month administrative fee, right? The idea behind this was that the people who were going to sign up for this, they're probably going to be more sophisticated people, because most of the time the wholesale prices in Texas are pretty low, but it's known that a few times a year they're going to get really high. And so you would anticipate that. And when those times came, you would have a generator that you would rely on. You would be able to radically reduce your electricity, and you would make money. You would save money overall, right?
Because just to stop you, clearly the services or whatever companies offering the fixed rate plans, they have to break even at least.
Correct.
So it's not they're just consistently undercharging their customers. The idea is during normal times when the wholesale price is low, they're actually charging their customers more with that fixed rate than they need, so that they can kind of get ahead. So then in the rare time when the wholesale price spikes and they're not allowed to pass it through, they have, and so, okay.
So, right. Yeah. So if you imagine that most of the time the wholesale price is like 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and occasionally it goes up to like $3 a kilowatt hour. And so the companies, the retail electric providers, like, okay, well, we'll do some fancy math to average it out, and we figure we can offer you 8 cents, right? And most of the time we're making money, and then sometimes like we're losing money, but it'll all even out, right? And so the concept behind Gritty was you can get the benefit of this most of the time that's cheap, and if you're able to seriously reduce your usage during that other time, you can get like all the all gain, no pain.
Right. So like Joe Rogan with his Bitcoin mining enterprise would totally want the Gritty plan. I don't know that he has a Bitcoin mining thing, but I'm just picturing something where that would make sense.
Something where, and this is something that it's more common for commercial and industrial customers than for residential customers, because the commercials, they have like more ability to just be like, okay, we're going to shut down.
Whereas a regular household, it's like you could say, oh, don't run the dishwasher right now, wait till 2 a.m. But in general, that seemed kind of crazy that you're going to monitor the wholesale price of electricity to adjust your usage.
Right.
If you're a house, whereas like you're saying, like a business, or my joke, somebody who in his garage has a bunch of Bitcoin mining operations going on where, you could like just, whoa, it's too expensive, turn that off and wait 24 hours kind of thing.
Yeah. So, obviously, it is apparent that not everyone who had signed up for these services were in that situation, and one of the companies, Evolve, they basically said, okay, we're just going to eat the different, like they said just before the storm, we're going to cap your rates at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and we'll eat the difference. Right. Mm-hmm. And Gritty said, we'll pay you $100 to switch to somebody else. So, and I think they're bankrupt now. I don't know. But, so clearly you did have some people who either didn't fully understand like the risk, downside risk or whatever it is. Probably the state is going to end up, prohibiting that business model, cause it's just hard. Like when you have a case, of someone with that large of an electric bill, even if they signed on the dotted line, right?
Right.
It's difficult to kind of justify that. What I do worry about with some of this is like overreaction in the opposite direction, because there is, I think, when you have these scarcity events, and this is true not only in Texas but everywhere, when you have these scarcity events, people will go on TV and they'll say, hey, everybody, the supply is going to be tight. Please conserve electricity, turn off your thermostats, don't run your dishwasher or whatever. And, that's fine. Like it's fine to try and use moral suasion like that. But there's not a lot of financial incentives built in order to try and encourage people to do that. And as an economist, that those price signals can be very powerful, right? So even if we don't want to fully expose people to like $9,000 an hour or whatever, I think that there are some things that we should be looking at for like, okay, how can we show people now is the time, it's like maybe, if you are in a situation where you're like, my thermostat is set to 68, but like I am perfectly, I've got some winter coats and I like saving money, I can take it down to 62, right? Whereas someone else, they might be like, no, I'll pay the extra, that's fine.
Right.
Having more of that in the system, I think would be a big help going forward. So I'm worried that there might be an overreaction to that.
Right. And that's because, I think we have mutual friends. I don't want to say her name, but like there are people with like young children and stuff in Texas that I saw, and they were like, hey, we've been without power for 18 hours at this point, and I have a 6-month-old. Like, this is not good, and it's, so right. When there's situations like that, we can talk about on the front end, different things, but given that you're in the thick of it and there is not enough electricity to go around, how do you determine where it goes? And even though it sounds horrible, we're like, no, prices that that's partly how you do know that certain people,
Right.
like just a bunch of frat guys hanging around, they can more afford, like, oh, just turn it off. Like you say, we'll put on our winter suits or snow suits or whatever, and we'll just sit around and be kind of funny. We'll start a fire. Somebody else that's got an elderly parent that they're caring for, or, they have like other kinds of medical equipment that needs electricity to run. It's like, no, that's life or death. I really need my power to be on. They might suck it up.
Right. Yeah. And like the way that it works now is it's kind of, I mean, it's not random, but to the consumer, it can seem kind of random because, as I mentioned, we, in our house, we never lost power at all. There were other people who were without power for 50 hours. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, I don't know if I should mention this or not, but like my dad, their house never lost power and they weren't even there. Like he was in Palm Springs for the week just because like
Mm-hmm.
he had vacation scheduled, And so like, I'm sure there are a lot of people that are like, freezing in the cold.
Right.
Meanwhile,
did he have his security porch lights on or something? Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. And there were, there were also, there were a lot of images of like people, in houses without power, like looking out over the like nice skyline with all the buildings lit up, or whatever on the, eventually, they were able to call the building manager and be like, hey, you should probably turn off, your signs right now.
Exactly.
But,
yeah.
That's just like, that's an extent to which that just is an example of, there's a lot of potential, what they call demand response that you could get out of the grid that we're not getting out of it because we don't have these financial, feedback mechanisms in place. Right.
And there's a similar thing too, like when there's water shortages, like in the summer typically, and then they say stuff like, hey, and then they have to do like voluntary, and then eventually like, no washing your car, no watering your lawn. And like they set up hotlines.
Right.
If you see your neighbor watering his lawn, then call this number. And why does that happen? It's again, because you don't have pricing. If the price could adjust, then everybody would decide, is it worth it to wash my car right now, or can I wait a week? So, do you have a sense, Josiah, about how much that was truly, like the fact that there were pockets of some people without power for whatever 3 days in a row, other people were fine? Is that just because the authorities decided where to impose the rolling blackouts, or part of it was just a technical issue of, the plants that would be supplying this neighborhood are just down? It's not a matter of if Josiah would be selfless and cut back, then we could have some more kilowatt hours for these people over here.
So it was definitely, I think a lot of it was based off technical limitations. The original plan was you were supposed to do, when you get into a scarcity shortage where you have to like voluntarily curtail people, you're supposed to do what they call like rolling blackouts.
Mm-hmm.
So you're on for half an hour, you're off for half an hour, and then they put you back on and take someone else off and like roll through it. And I guess because they had, you never had an event of this scale before, they found out in Austin, where I am, and some other places too, when they went to do the rolling blackouts, they found out it's like, oh, well, we can't actually turn this place off because it's next to a hospital, and we can't take this place off because there's like, it's connected to like some, critical grid infrastructure, and like you start adding that up, and next thing you know, they're like, well, we can't turn any, we can't do any more rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of that I think has to do with the way that like their circuits are segmented and other things that they could probably do a better job of.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so for example, the entire downtown in Texas, in Austin, is I guess on a single circuit, and there's some critical stuff there. So that means that has to stay on. But as a result, all these empty office buildings were staying on, right? So that's the part where I think you could, there's two ways to get people to reduce their energy consumption. One is you can like flip the switch and say, haha, you don't have power anymore.
Right.
And the other is like on your end, you can say, okay, I'm going to turn off lights. I'm going to reduce the thermostat or the stuff. And that's the part where I don't think that the price signals can be very helpful, or other sorts of financial signals, could do a lot.
I remember after I graduated Hillsdale a semester early, and so before I went to NYU, I moved up to Chicago, and I was broke. I didn't, it was my first real job or whatever that summer, and so we were living in a very economically depressed neighborhood, and it was far away. It was a neighborhood of color. They the people there, it was largely Hispanic, and we were one of the few white people who lived there. And when rolling blackouts hit, our neighborhood got zapped, or didn't get zapped, as it were. But then when I took the train and went into my office building where we worked, everything was fine. And and so that's where I got a sense that I think, if the government is in charge of who gets electricity when push comes to shove, it's not going to be the disadvantaged people who don't have a lot of money that are going to be the ones favored. I think they're going to come up with, no, actually, your neighborhood needs to be the one right now that suffers.
Yeah, right. Definitely, there's a lot of talk about that, about who was able to keep power and who wasn't, and how does it track with the if you were to track it based on income dynamics or racial dynamics or other things, people are interested in that. Maybe it is systemic racism, right?
Well, right. I mean, but it's true that So my point, just being, in case people didn't get, is that my concern is that, when the people on the left who want the government to get involved and regulate it, because it's such an important commodity, is to say, well, okay, but when you get away from price signals and then just have to be up to politics, it's not as if the people that you're worried, the same people that the police might be more likely to abuse, are not all of a sudden going to be the ones that have their power restored quickly. Almost, so that it's kind of naive to say that. And it's, high prices are a thing, but at least, you have a shot if you have somebody who really, because they're caring for a relative. Or do you, on that issue, I guess my thought, I'm wondering what you agree with this, not, is I was shocked when I saw those stories about somebody got hit with a $17,000 bill. Because I just thought, I was clicking through, can that be right? And so I think if you are going to have something like that, there really does need to be some kind of, I don't know what, neon lights or something. Well, not neon lights, because that uses, but you need to know what you're just kind of like with the Uber. I'm a big fan of surge pricing for Uber, but some of the horror stories you would hear, like somebody, he's kind of hammered on New Year's Eve and he gets in the thing and then the guy drops him off and it's a $200 bill because I think there should be kind of a thing in the front end, hey, do you understand this ride is going to cost you $200? Do you agree with that? And the same thing with this.
If you, I was thinking about that, from an ideal, libertarian perspective, how would you deal with this? And I don't know if obviously you want to make sure, you would definitely want to make sure up front that people really know what the, what they're getting themselves in for potentially. And I don't know, if you would want to say okay, well, do you have, you have backup generation in case of an emergency? Are you able to completely curtail in case of emergency or whatever? Those sorts of requirements. Maybe you could, I'm sure creative people could work out some sort of system. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's not where we are.
Well, I just mean also in terms of the customs and what, if you go into a restaurant,
right,
and you sit down and they say, okay, and the waitress comes over, okay, what'll it be? And he goes, give me a Coke right now while I think about things. And then they give you the Coke and they wait till you take one sip and say, oh, by the way, you didn't ask, but the Cokes in this restaurant cost $300. Did you know that?
Right.
I wouldn't think, well, as a libertarian, the rules are so if you wanted to do that, there would have to be signs, and the waitress would have to say, if you're going to order a Coke, make sure because you're from this area and you might think a Coke is at most, $3 or something, but no, it's actually $300. Are you sure you want a Coke?
Right. And I'm sure, I haven't looked at the gritty contracts or something. I'm sure that if you read in the fine print, there's something in there where it's oh, by the way, the price, prices can go wherever and blah, blah, blah. But, to the extent that people really understood that, it's not clear. Right. And maybe someone did understand it, but then their generator broke and, they're well,
because part of it is the people that got hit with the 17,000, I would imagine most of them would have turned everything off if they had realized as they're sitting there, that light that we have turned on, if we just turn that light off, we would save $800. I think most people would have done that.
Right. And particularly because the way gritty, it's not, the way Gritty is set up, it's not simply that you like wait till the end of the month and then you get your bill, but they're like charging money to your credit card in real time. So you get these like notifications that like, another $45 or whatever has been charged to your credit card. So you would know like, things are getting bad, right? I need to turn off everything. So I assume that's the situation that they were in, but, I don't know.
So I guess, just generally speaking, like what would you recommend then is, what should the Texas authorities do to fix this?
What I would say is like, if you're gonna do something to restrict this, business model, which they probably are, just make it as narrow as possible, because we don't know, you don't know what other we're getting to a point with a lot of technologies where, smart meters and other stuff, you can do, there's a lot of inventive stuff that you can do on like curbing demand, and price signals are very important. So just make sure that you don't do something like sweeping where you're like, well, you have to be on a fixed rate, right? Or something like that. You can't vary it. You can't vary it at all based on like real time prices or whatever, right? Because I think that there are ways that you can do that can be very valuable to the system, even if you don't want people to like face the downside of $17,000 a month bills, right? I mean, we have like even the Texas, even in the wholesale market, we do have this $9,000 a megawatt hour cap, which is really high, but it is a cap. It has you can't do $20,000 a megawatt hour, right? You can't do $100,000 a megawatt hour. So if you're going to do something like maybe you would do something analogous on the retail side. I don't know.
And
just keep it as limited as possible is what I would.
And ironically, I thought, what's the lieutenant governor's name? Is it Patrick?
Dan Patrick.
Daniel Patrick. Okay, it's funny because I was like, I want to say his name's Daniel, but now I think his name's Patrick, and so I was right. So it'd be funny if someone said, "Hey, is your name Daniel or Patrick?" And he said, "Yes." So his comments, the ones that Krugman, I think totally mischaracterized in one of Krugman's columns, saying, "Oh, Dan Patrick says that people should have read the fine print and they deserve those 17,000." And no, what he actually said was, and I thought it was pretty reasonable for all things, was to say, for those people who got these outrageous, these very high bills, don't panic. We're looking into it. So that suggests, we're going to roll some or all of this back. And then he said, and going forward, though, make sure you read the fine print. And we may even just outlaw these types of contracts altogether because people were caught so much off guard. So that's actually pretty reasonable to say this. We know it was shocking and you didn't expect this. So you're not going to be on the hook for these bills. But if we do allow these types of contracts, you have to really look at the fine print and realize this is possible. Do you want this plan or not? And you know what? We might not even give you that option just because I realize this is so crazy. So it kind of almost sounded like you. And yet that was, Krugman used that quote to make it look like he was saying, "Aha, you got it, suckers. You should have read the fine print."
It's not like, you should have looked to see that like, shredded glass Cheerios was not safe,
Right.
That's not what he's saying.
It's a bag of glass, yeah. Okay, so are you optimistic then about what they're going to, or you are concerned they're going to swing the pendulum so much?
Kind of pessimistic. I think, there's been a lot of bills that have been filed on this. Some of them are probably okay, but there's also been a lot of bad stuff. And, in particular, there has been a lot of stuff. There have been a lot of bills filed, that are punitive against renewables, particularly wind. And, as I say, like, I'm against the production tax credit. I think that should go away, but I don't think that it's kind of like the von Mises socialism point that like you cause one market distortion and then you like try to do another market distortion or whatever. So some of the things that they're talking about are like, taxing wind or like making wind bear all the like, surge costs or whatever, other things like that, that would be, functionally prohibitive or destructive, for the industry. And I don't think that does not seem like a productive use of state power. And there's other stuff too that I don't know is really like getting to the heart of the matter. So I, hopefully as things move through the process, there's more time for deliberation and counter argument and will prevail. But as often happens in a crisis, crisis tends to be good for government, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm afraid that you're going to see some of that here, even in Texas.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think we should underscore, it's implicit in what we're saying, but I've even seen some fans of the free market say, this $9,000 per megawatt hour thing was crazy. Like ERCOT said it didn't need to be that high. Like they were shedding low, and anyway, it was a physical thing. The storm knocked it out and whatever. Like it doesn't matter how high the price went. It's not that they couldn't have someone in the neighboring state was going to send a truck over with some kilowatt hours. That's not going to work. But as you're pointing out, it's not merely, so yes, one function of, having a sky high price when there's a crisis is to bring in more supply if that's possible physically, but also to ration demand. And so that, even a lot of free market people, like I said, I think are missing that element of it, that part of the function of high prices is to get people to cut back on their consumption.
Right.
And then, you're talking about some of the, they're recoiling against wind. I guess, can you just speak a little bit, like even in a free market, because some people hearing our discussion might have said, well, even Josiah is admitting wind, the capacity is not 1-for-1 with that. Why would anybody want wind ever? And is the answer because when it does work, it's cheaper than natural gas?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons why you might want wind. One is it tends to be pretty cheap. It has a zero fuel cost, unlike natural gas or coal, which not only tends to make it cheaper, but it also means that there's more, you're not subject to like price spikes because the fuel price goes up, right? Mm-hmm. So with natural gas, if the cost of natural gas, the substance increases a lot, then the cost of producing natural gas electricity goes up, right? You don't have that worry so much for wind. There are also environmental advantages. Not only, people talk about climate change, but, both coal and gas plants, there's some environmental issues, which involves regulation and permitting and approval problems. And then with nuclear plants, that's clean. You don't have any of that, but you do have to worry about meltdown, right? Mm-hmm. And that also, not only are those things that you worry about themselves, but to deal with them somehow is going to create costs, whether it's like regulation, approvals, periods. It takes like decades to build a nuclear plant, or same thing with coal and nuclear. Coal and natural gas. So that's something that you just don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about that hassle if with wind, right? Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is that it tends to be a little bit more scalable. So a lot of the thermal plants, if you're going to build a plant, you're going to build something that's pretty big, right? And that, of course, increases your capital costs and, makes you more vulnerable to like swings in the market or whatever. Whereas with wind and solar, it's like Legos. You can do a little bit, or you can build it big.
Okay, right. Mm-hmm.
And so that, there's some economic advantages to doing it that way. That's about it. But I think the big things are price and just like the environmental factors.
Okay, so you think even in a totally free energy market, especially in a place like Texas with a lot of wind, that it would make sense. It would be economical for there to be like a bunch of wind capacity, but backed up by either nuclear or natural gas, or coal too. Like if there's no issue about they're going to be a carbon tax down the road or prohibitions on emissions.
There still would be less wind on the system, but I think there still would be a substantial amount. And wind and natural gas actually complement each other kind of well, because natural gas plants have it's a lot easier for them to like ramp up and down how much power they're producing. That's like, as I mentioned earlier, you usually use natural gas for peaker plants because you're not running them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that there still would be a lot of wind on the system, and it would be, there would be advantages coming to that, right? Even if you're not going to have an all wind system, right, or an all wind and solar system, right? You're still going to. It's like like you restaurants. You're not going to have all burger places or whatever, or all ice cream places or whatnot, but they still are economically advantageous, right? And there it exists, fill a niche in the market. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other things you wanted to cover in our joint podcast?
I don't think so. Yeah. I would just say that I am a fan of the show. I'm not. You may remember this. A while back, you asked people to like flip a coin to decide whether they should.
Right.
Yeah. So I flipped the coin and it came up tails or whichever the one was where like I wasn't going to donate.
Uh-huh.
And so I always feel like, well, I'm not like a patron exactly, but I'm a probabilistic patron.
Right.
Murphy show. I don't know how.
But I hope you did it correctly because you were supposed to set the time horizon. You know what
Right,
I mean?
well,
Like to
that's the
say,
question.
am I going to donate this year or not? And then that was.
Yeah, I don't remember what the time horizon. Maybe I need to flip another coin.
I'm probably you do. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just the last hour, I've been trying to come up with a pun about like seeing the picture over your shoulder to say like, oh, we need a grid that's available for all seasons or something. But
very good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I keep that picture to remind me about what they do to honest lawyers, right? They cut their heads off.
We'll leave it as an exercise for the viewer to know what we're talking about. We'll see. Okay, well, my guest has been Josiah Neeley. So, Josiah, thanks for being on the Bob Murphy Show.
Yeah, and my guest has been Bob Murphy. So, Bob, thank you very much for joining the Urbane Cowboys.
Okay, well, thanks. So, take care, Josiah.
Hey, Sally, look at this website. It's showing that the government is a bunch of evil morons. Billy, I see what you're saying, but actually, I'm not so sure these arguments are very good. What? You're for the government? That's just stupid.
No, Billy, you're the one being stupid.
Bob!
That's right, kids. It's possible to have an argument with a conclusion that's true, even though the argument itself is wrong. For example, suppose I were to say 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, the sun is hot. You see what I'm talking about? It's actually not a valid argument, even though, in this case, both the premise and the conclusion are true. So just keep that in mind.
Thanks, Bob. Now we know.
And knowing's half the battle.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.